Welcome back, and I hope your workshops and certainly the CEO forum, which I attended, were productive. We've slightly opened this up to give you a bit more breathing space, but don't think you're safe at the back. I want to be able to see your hands go up as well. So don't think that you're hiding from me. We want to keep the momentum, the excellent momentum from this morning. Remember, there's a very clear message which needs to be sent out about the need to reduce carbon and reduce costs. And we've had some very frank discussions, but also frank revelations, I think, in the last 6 hours. And we want to continue that spirit for the next couple of sessions, which should go on for about the next hour and a half. And first of all, I'd like to introduce Bram De Graaff, who's Director of Climate and Sustainability for PwC. We're looking at green finance, and we're looking at ESG. And I've already said to Bram, you better explain what ESG is, because I've found at conferences that people say, yes, 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 I know what ESG is, but then you ask them what E and S and G stand for, and they look at you blankly. I was at a conference similar to this with about 120 board members, board chairs, and also C-suiters. And I decided to pause the discussion and ask, can I just be clear, are you all comfortable with net zero? And almost no hands went up. And then I said, how many of you have actually got a net zero policy within your company? Again, almost no hands went up. This staggered a lot of people. Don't worry, I won't do it to you. But I say that because it's easy to slip into the jargon without really understanding the enormity of what it's trying to cover. So Bram, my first thought to you is you better explain and just confirm what ESG is, and then Ehab will come to you afterwards with your reflections as well.
Sounds good. Good afternoon all, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much, Nick, for the intro, and of course the WCA for having me here today. To jump sort of straight in, so ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And those are really kind of three key pillars that, when it originated, were sort of the pillars for investors to look at when they look at a broader set of different criteria when they assess sort of projects and sort of investable assets. So it sort of originated in the financial services sector through a kind of a UN-convened initiative called UNEP, the UN Environment Programme Finance Initiative, so another nice acronym for you there. And the idea was really, as I said, to kind of look beyond the lens of corporate social responsibility at the sort of factors that, if you don't take them into account as an investor, they may lead to sometimes very sudden short-term impact, but also very much kind of long-term consequences.
And I should add as well, Bram, you've got some data to share with us, but there really is a reassessment of what ESG means, you know, whether it be in the Financial Times, The Economist, a real sense of ESG version 1.0 and a demand for a 2.0 version. In other words, greater clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. So the term originated sort of in 2004. That's literally nearly 20 years ago. And I think it's only over the past 2-3 years that we really see it sort of take on a lot. But to your point, with that, a lot of criticism has sort of set in as well. And you may have all sort of followed the media over the past few months. You know, there's been quite a lot of critique on ESG as being either too broad and hence not well defined, or kind of just not clear about the individual priorities that sit within it. So I definitely think there's a need to sort of rethink.
But you at PwC have greater clarity.
Well, absolutely, but I would indeed say, to your point, that it's really critical to think about the individual topics that fall under kind of environment, social, and governance. Don't look at it as a single umbrella term, because it becomes very hard to kind of comprehend what the kind of implications are on the ground practically.
Give us your thoughts about where it is on green finance and ESG.
Sorry, could you just elaborate on the
Well, your slides.
Oh, yeah, sure, yeah. So what I thought I'd just do is put together a few quick slides, really just kind of introduce the topic. Clearly, they're closely related, but not entirely. ESG, as I mentioned, are these sort of factors to look at, was green finance really is the integration of green criteria within sort of financial decisions. What I thought I'd do is and here we go with the issue of definition, is kind of zoom in on the climate element of ESG to start with. And I've kind of put two big figures on the slide here. On the left-hand side, you see a number directly from a report we at PwC issued last week, which is a kind of an annual publication that we call Net Zero Economy Index. And what we look at is how sort of the global economy needs to decarbonize to still meet sort of the agreements made during the Paris Agreement a few years ago, which is to really limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, I hope you can see the numbers on the slide, but basically, over the past 10, 20 years, decarbonization, that is the number of emissions per dollar of GDP, have decreased at about a rate of 1.4% a year. Now, in order for us to meet that still, it needs to go down to 15% a year to kind of still meet that target. So clearly a massive step up from where we are, or from where we were before. On the right-hand side, then, is an estimate by one kind of particular initiative that works in this space, the Climate Policy Initiative. And they estimate that by 2030, we need to go to kind of an annual investment of about $4 trillion to be able to meet sort of all the requirements to move to net zero by 2050. To date, that sits at around 600 or 700 billion. So again, a massive sort of step up in requirements there. Now, clearly, governments around the globe have really stepped up on this. We've seen some major commitments come out of the EU over the past couple of years through the kind of Green Deal. So $1 trillion of investment has been committed there over the next 10 years. Clearly, peanuts compared to the number I just showed in the other slide. And they also set up a very kind of elaborate plan for sustainable finance to really make sure that that market is being used to mobilize the funding that's needed, because clearly just public funding is not going to sort of cut it. We've seen similar kind of commitments come from elsewhere. Obviously, you will have seen the Inflation Reduction Act in the US that sort of passed Congress a couple of months ago, which also made a very kind of significant commitment of about 400 billion to this. But again, a big gap to fill, and that's where kind of sustainable finance and the financial community really comes into play. Closer to home here for us, so the UAE is committed to net zero by 2050, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia by 2060. So clearly that's going to lead to kind of significant action on the ground as well. Now, as I said, sort of that has already triggered sort of flows of funds into this. So what you see here on the left-hand side is sort of the issuance of sustainable bonds over the past few years. Sustainable bonds is quite a complex landscape. It consists of green bonds, of social bonds, climate bonds. They have sort of different numbers. But what it really means is that you raise sort of debt capital to use for kind of sustainable projects. And what we've seen there is a massive growth over the last few years. Likewise, we've seen a real big increase in sort of equity that's labeled as ESG, and you will have followed some of that in the news around sort of investment funds being set up in this space, and we've seen a massive increase there as well. Sort of from an industry perspective, again, loads of banks and investors that are making commitments to channeling funds in this direction. So the Principles for Responsible Investment, for example, have done quite a bit of work in this space and really mobilized the global investment community to sign up to certain kind of behaviors of responsible investment. But then also out of COP26, so the Conference of the Parties 26, which took place in the UK last year, we saw a major commitment from the financial services sector. Lastly, then, it's really critical to maintain and accelerate that momentum. So, one thing you'll hear a lot from the sustainable finance community is that there's a real need for clear measurement and reporting on this. So, whilst we have a lot of different reporting standards, these are not aligned still, and there's a lot of work taking place in that field. It's also important to get policy coherent and get the incentives right, and happy to unpick that later. But of course, no company can go all the way voluntarily. We need to make sure that the playing field is leveled and that the right incentives are in play. And then it's also important to kind of deal with the current energy crisis. And you hear some critical voices that sort of suggest that this is something that may distract us from ESG and green finance in the short term. But of course, the long-term picture here shouldn't change. And then, doing this in a fair way, making sure that there's buy-in from across the spectrum of stakeholders is really key. And it's also important for us to address concerns of greenwashing.
How valid do you think those concerns of greenwashing are?
Quite valid. To answer that question directly,
Are you talking about an instinct for deception or misleading?
Not really either of those, but clearly ESG is something that a lot of consumers these days indicate they're interested in. It's an important topic for many different stakeholders, and so of course being able to label something as ESG or sustainable or responsible, ethical will definitely go down well with consumers. So
I just mentioned, and we mentioned it up in the CEO meeting as well, the case of DWS, the German bank, which used to be a part of Deutsche Bank, where they were caught out by a whistleblower who said what you're saying, what you're reporting to the annual meeting and in your annual report, in our annual report, is simply not correct, is not truthful. And it ended up with 50 inspectors going in and the chief executive resigning. What's your instinct as to whether that's indicative of a culture which is one of hoping you can get away with it?
That particular point might be a little bit hard to comment on, but I certainly think, as I said, if you label products as ESG, of course, it will resonate better in the market these days. I do, though, think that, through this example, but many others, it's clear that if you don't get it right, it will eventually come back to you. So it's really in the interest of these companies to make sure that they do this correctly.
So it's quite a risk.
It's certainly a risk, and I think that's why we see a lot more regulatory action in this space now to really crack down on it. So in France, for example, we see that there's severe fines associated with sort of wrongfully labeling products as green or kind of ESG compliant.
Can you just go back go back to that one? No, go forward now.
Yeah.
I was just very struck watching it go through, and if you can see it further back, when you say there specifically ESG labeled assets, it's as if, even you at PwC can never be quite sure whether it really is ESG or not.
Yeah, so look, what we see now, that's probably right to some degree. What we see now is that there is a lot of self-labeling going on. There's a lot of standards development, but at the end of the day, these things are largely still defined by sort of individual companies. We do see in the bond space, so what the chart on the left-hand side sort of demonstrates, we do have quite a few global standards on this now, and there's very clear kind of certification and assurance practices for that. But absolutely, I mean, there's been quite a large group of investment funds that have recently had their ESG label removed, even by the very institutions that provided those, just because they realized it probably wasn't entirely sort of accurate.
And can you go back two more?
Yeah.
Thank you, Bram. The next one. Because I was intrigued, and it's very difficult for you to see this at the back. 15.2% annual decarbonization rate between now and 2050.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one of the points which came out time and time again this morning is 2050 is too late. There's got to be an urgency for 2028, 2030. And also the comparison between 2050 on the left and the US 4 trillion investment by 2030. I'm just trying to work out from you what your time frame is for considering these figures. Because 2050, no one in position of responsibility is going to be there in 20 years' time.
Yeah, yeah. No, fully agreed. Look, when we published this report last year, we kind of introduced this decade as the decade of action. So this is the sort of pivotal decade. If we don't get it right now, sort of by 2030, then it's really hard to correct for it later on. So you may see sort of that, the lowest curve here that has the gray label on it with 15%. You can indeed see that sort of a good 2/3 of that will need to happen before 2030 to stay on track for 2050. So absolutely, early action is really critical.
Does anyone want to come in before we move on? Anyone want to challenge any questions? Please, yeah. Microphone there. Anyone else? Then I can get the second microphone. And at the front from Amr. Could you bring the second microphone to here, please? Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah.
And introduce yourself again.
Sure. My name is Apoorv Sinha. I'm with Carbon Upcycling, a Canadian carbon tech company. Curious about, like, when you look at that spike of investment, I mean, there's already been a lot of talk, at least in North America, about how the IRA might actually exacerbate inflation and, you know, create other macroeconomic kind of issues that maybe would get further exacerbated if you put another $3.5 trillion in over, I go by your plot there, in the next couple of years, and then keep it at that level. So just kind of curious about how you think of that systemically, because obviously if everything becomes more expensive, then the cost of decarbonization in real dollars also gets higher, which will further discourage people from moving quickly. So how do you get away from that downward spiral?
Yeah. Now, thank you very much for the question. Look, obviously, what this is looking to do is in a slightly sort of sanitized way, think about, well, how much more needs to go into this. I think either way, unfortunately, we're never going to get that sort of increase in funding overnight. But I guess what you're alluding to is indeed sort of supply chain constraints, that if you, or supply side constraints, sorry, which is, you know, if you suddenly kind of increase demand by that much, where are you going to get it from? And of course, as you may know, renewable energy, for example, also has many other environmental concerns associated with it. So there certainly is also a risk. We narrowly focus on carbon and don't really think of the broader implications there.
Does that give you an answer? Have you still got the microphone? Come back. Where's the microphone? Don't take a microphone away when there's a supplementary, please. Well, I'm giving you the chance.
Consultant answer. But just kind of curious, I agree with you. I think it has to be a systemic, you know, even deploying carbon capture and storage at full scale, just like with solar or wind, will have other impact.
Yeah.
I'm just curious as to how, from a policy perspective or from a chief executive perspective at a cement company, how you wrangle with that, because it's not very straightforward and you have incomplete information. And to your point, you only have 30-odd quarters, maybe 32 quarters before 2030, so you don't have a huge amount of time to put some pegs in the ground.
Yeah.
In other words, is your analysis urgent enough?
Look, just to be clear, these numbers are not sort of, I'm sort of quoting some other numbers here, but could you, just in terms of, you're talking about sort of the impact it has on cement companies and how they sort of can respond to this, right?
Yeah, like before lunch, there was a lot of talk about how policy needs to enable these kind of rates, but if policy is moving in the other direction, macro, how do they still achieve their net zero commitments between now and 2030?
No, look, so that policy coherence is absolutely critical, and so purely just investing this is not sort of going to get you there. That, I suppose that's the point I tried to make on sort of the last slide I showed, which is, if on the one hand you asked to invest in this space, on the other hand you've got other incentives that kind of offset that, it's going to be really challenging to deal with that, and hence it's really critical to look at this in a very comprehensive way, look at sort of other regulatory changes that need to take place in addition to this, because otherwise, to your point, it's very hard to justify investing in it.
Amma.
I know that finance is quite a complicated topic, and but I want to ask right through a question. Anybody can tell what is a currency index, and if I asked you about the projection of any market, you will be able to answer very precisely on investment forecasting of an index. When are we going to see an ESG index that actually tells what is green and what is gray, and how much green is green? When is this going to happen, and what is the barriers?
Very good question. So this is exactly what sort of the Sustainable Finance Action Plan in the EU is looking to address through their taxonomy. So what they've done, and that's sort of work in progress currently, is really define what qualifies as green and what doesn't. You may have picked up that there's been a few grey areas, particularly around sort of the use of natural gas, for example. Nuclear was another kind of sticky point. But that's exactly what's happening now, is really define what qualifies as actions to mitigate climate change, what qualifies as investment focused on adaptation, and then there's sort of 4 other environmental buckets they look into. And that's being introduced. Companies will be asked to report on it. And that's really meant to make sure that investors that want to put their money into sustainable activities know exactly what does and doesn't qualify as sustainable.
May I follow up, Nick? The ESG has been in the market since 2004.
Yeah.
And this exact discussion happened in the United States in 2008 and happened again in 2012 and was repeated in the Paris Agreement and was repeated in Glasgow. And the dimensions to it are quite clear. And what is green is quite obvious, at least 90% of it. And do you think that the financial sector really have the urge to distinguish between green and gray?
Good question. Look, as you say, for sure, there's a topic that's been debated for a long time. I think the conversation has moved on quite a bit since then. Look, financial service companies will feel pressure from their own investors and asset owners. They will feel it from consumers. The other thing, though, is that, of course, this is not so much just focused on impact and the impact that these investments have on sort of climate change, but also very much from a risk perspective. And so the way banks are asked to look at this, for example, now is really think about what they call the physical risk of climate change and how that impacts their asset base, and also the transition risk or all the policy-related risk. So it's doing the right thing, but it's also very much kind of in their own interest to make sure that this is monitored properly and make sure that you don't suddenly get exposed to excessive risk.
Without leaving us with the risk of you sending us an invoice afterwards, Bram, what recommendation, what advice would you give to the representatives of the cement industry here about what they've got to do, how they can tackle this? Given, and I'm raising what we raised several times this morning, given the real tension now between liquidity, rising costs, a grim outlook for business, but also at the same time, the massive expectation that the cement industry has got to change very quickly. In other words, I likened it to a Rubik's Cube. You can get one side of the Rubik's Cube in place, but the rest of it is all over the place still.
Yeah. Look, I would say that the one thing that's just really, really important to get right now is just your story and being able to articulate what your sort of company's stance is towards this topic. I think there's a lot of recognition that it is a long journey and that whilst there may be low-hanging fruit in the short term, there's obviously going to be some very substantial changes that need to take place later, part of which requires sort of technological advancements that don't quite exist yet. But being able to articulate a story, articulate a commitment, say you have a roadmap in place, say you know what objective you're aiming to achieve, I think is really, really critical.
And comparisons with other sectors you're dealing with here in MENA, here in the UAE, particularly when it comes to the challenge of reducing carbon by 1/3 by 2030. Are there other sectors where this is being shown to be achievable?
Look, obviously every sector has a very different reality, and cement and concrete is obviously one of the most sort of heavy emitting sectors. So I suppose kind of office-based sectors will be able to kind of make these moves much quicker. Heavy manufacturing more broadly will have opportunities like that, and I think we're seeing quite some substantial changes. It is also very company-specific, so it's hard to just talk about sectors in general. I think it's really critical to look at the kind of company-specific.
But is there one particular key you could identify which would help open that door?
Yeah, look, I think, and I believe that the next topic here is around operational excellence.
Yeah.
I mean, the first key thing is to really look at it through a lens of efficiencies in the operations, and what you find, particularly in the short term, is that kind of operational efficiency and environmental impact sort of go very much hand in hand. After that, it's more about sort of step changes in technology and production processes.
All right, does anyone want to come back? Anyone want to come in on that particular answer? Yes, please, at the back. And the further back you are, the more appreciative I would be if you could use a bit of white paper, then I can see you in the dark.
Alex Hall, I'm from Concrete AI in the US. Just out of curiosity, what you've just said is really of interest to me, because even at 480 CO2e, how does a cement company get to net zero without significant removal purchases? And those are through the roof from a cost perspective. I mean, from your guys' perspective, what does it do for the economic sustainability of the industry?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so Nick, to maybe pick up on your point, just in terms of definition. So net zero, what it means is to kind of reduce your emissions as far as you can. And then if there's nothing else that can be done, is kind of reduce that through kind of alternative means, one of which may be, for example, carbon capture and storage, or it's kind of investing in offsetting schemes. It will be extremely critical indeed for the cement sector to sort of think about what that maximum is before it really sort of starts to impact your bottom line. And again, to my earlier point, being very clear on what some of the technological advancements are that are needed to kind of get there to that step change.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, because we certainly have clients that, for example, build data centers. So these are at the other end of the supply chain. These are like FANG companies that are pretty heavily invested in the capital asset as well. And they've totally pivoted. They've got to the point now where they want the lowest embodied CO2 concrete today, because some of them have got 2030 targets for net zero. So they're understanding the cost of those removals today, because they ultimately recognize that their requirement is going to be the removal. The offset means nothing to them. The offset's going to come into the base. They're going to have to purchase the removal. I just think it's something the industry really does need to be aware of, because medium term, these things aren't going to get cheaper until there's certainly significant removal technology on the market, which I know there's a lot of money being thrown at various technologies right now, but there's a major financial impact as a consequence of this.
Yeah, and that's a reality policymakers really need to take into account. So purely forcing you to reduce without consideration of how it impacts the economics of the sector would almost be a reckless thing to do. And this is where kind of working in partnership with suppliers, your customers, and indeed policymakers will be really, really critical to achieve that.
All right, Bram, well, let's pause one moment and move to Ehab Shalaby. We've heard from you earlier, Ehab, Chief Executive of DCarbon. Pick up on any of these points, but also the particular points that you want to make in relation to the issue of ESG and green finance, picking up what Bram has said, and you maybe need to pass on the handset.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thank you so much, Bram. I'd like to pick up on Bram, complementing some of his points. And let's start by the ESG itself. In the past, and as I mentioned in the morning session, we only focused on an E, which is the economic dimension of the business. Now, we are talking about not shareholders' value, but company impact. So we complemented them by E, which is the environment, S is the social dimension, and G. There is a problem in the G understanding. By G, we don't mean governance. By G, we mean governance of social and environmental impacts. So it should be read as environmental and social governance. This is how we can govern environmental and social dimensions of the issue. What is the new trend is that we are bringing again on the table the E. So we are talking environmental, E, big E, and small e for emissions alone, because some persons are saying that we don't want all this mess of ESG. Our urgency is climate. We want to bring emissions out of this equation and focus on it. So there are now, in fact, two strands of thoughts. One is saying focus on the ESG as a variable, and the other is saying let's focus on the emissions as a clear-cut point for now. This is basically in continuation of Bram's idea. Second, concerning what is the definition of green? In fact, there are two approaches to define what is green to avoid greenwashing. The first way is to draft a Bible of what is green, and this was the EU taxonomy way. Whenever you say green, go back to the Bible, and the Bible will tell you what is the definition of green across every industry we have. And this is a very radical move that has been done by the European Union. But there's another way of defining what is called green, which is not defining it by components or process, but rather defining it by impact. And this is the EBRD approach that has been mentioned in the new kind of loans that are called impact loans. So I'm giving you some loans on one condition. This loan will be linked to the amount of emission you reduced. I don't care how you reduced it. So this is called an impact and not a process-driven approach. Another thing about the amount, the gentleman from the behind who was asking about how do you quantify these numbers while we are, if I understood the question correctly, how do you quantify these numbers? And we all know that with time, the incremental costs of reducing CO2 emissions rise. Definitely, I agree with you. For example, the cost of energy efficiency models in the cement industry is 1/3 the cost of adding renewable energy as a value proposition, for example. So we start by the low costs and then we move to the high costs. According to the Sustainable Investment Alliance, I encourage everybody here in the room to read the final report of the Global Sustainable Investment Alliance 2020. According to this alliance, the global ESG assets reached 36 trillion US dollar. This 36 trillion US dollar constitute approximately 1/3 of the global GDP. The surprising issue is not this. The surprising issue is other two factors. Number one, it is increasing annually by 16%, the figure that Bram copied and mentioned here in his slides. And this means that we will reach 100% ESG assets under management before 2030. This is number one. A second issue that is very important and that was mentioned and affirmed both by a study by Harvard and by BlackRock Investment Fund is that, they studied the difference between traditional investments and ESG investments during COVID. And what was found that ESG investment during COVID continued rising while traditional investments retarded back. What this sent us as a message is that ESG investment is more resilient to external shocks rather than traditional investments. And this is something important in a world that will carry a lot of disruptions in the coming days. A final note to complement where we can with here is that I hope I can deliver this message clearly. In the new world, the term compliance does not mean regulatory compliance. I have heard a lot about regulatory compliance, but with the sense of the regulator needs. What I can see over the period of the years of my work in the ESG is that the term compliance is more or less now related to market compliance and not regulatory compliance. In fact, the regulatory compliance part of the issue is coming back. Today, the compliance is coming from the financier, is coming from the investor, is coming from the country we export to, is coming from my competition, is coming from the framework such as EDGE and BREEAM. Can you imagine that when I provide cement to an EDGE building in Egypt, as if I'm exporting to the outside of the world, because I'm exporting to the framework. I now have to comply with the standards. So these are overall takeaways. In fact, what I wanted to communicate with you in this regard, if you allowed me now to do it, is to have, I think I will discuss three major, very quick ideas with you. As I told you before, we need to reconstruct the narrative. This is your socio-economic impact from an Egyptian perspective. If you can see the construction and real estate sector, it contributes. It's the second contributor to average growth. It's among the first contributor to GDP growth rates. It's among the number one contributor to investment to the country, and it's approximately number 2 in the number of workers. This is the socio-economic implications of the construction and real estate industry. What is my major takeaway here? My major takeaway for you here, don't see cement in isolation. Cement needs to construct its narrative within the built environment, which is construction and real estate. My second takeaway here is, this is exactly the impact of the industry on GHG emissions. According to the biennial updated report, which I had the honor to participate in with the UNFCCC, with the government of Egypt and the UNFCCC, energy constitutes 64% of the GHG emissions in Egypt. Out of this energy, 23% are industries and construction. Okay? What does this mean? This means that your share in energy as a cement sector, as a construction sector as whole, is approximately 15% only from the energy component. لسه في IPPU component to be having here. طيب. If we want to see them as in the IPPU component, here we can add also 51% of the IPPU component comes of the cement sector. So 51 out of 12% is 6%. And 23% out of the 64% is 15%. Both figures gives you that as much as the sector has positive socio-economic implications, as much as it has negative implications on climate emissions. Now, what is the solution? The solution is very simple. Egypt emits 325 million ton of CO2 emissions, 0.6% of the global emissions. Approximately 20% is the share of the construction sector. This is now. The problem is not with now. The problem is with the projections. With 2% population growth rates and with 7% GDP growth rates and with urbanization pressure, we are talking about a problem that is related to the flow and not a problem that is related to the stock of GHG emissions type. Therefore, what is the solution? The solution is simply to do decouple. How can we decouple? This is our story and narrative. We need to decouple socio-economic implications of the sector from its environmental degradation. This is the first message and the simple message where we will all align behind all stakeholders, not only across the value chain, but also across the different perspectives. This is what is happening right now. This is the old model of capitalism. These are all the stakeholders in the capitalistic system. What is happening right now is that everybody is attacking the cement industry by one way or another. We have the financial systems, and we saw the EBRD in the morning. We have the investors needing framework, as they call Briam, telling him, is this company complying with ESG frameworks or not, or we are going to withdraw our investments. The government is putting regulation. The consumer is now have awareness about the problem, and to export to the rest of the world, we have to comply. Everybody is putting the sector in this area. What we need to do is to come back with one voice and reflect on all of this. How does the investor allow this? This is exactly what Bram was talking about, frameworks. We have here compliance frameworks. We have here financial frameworks. We have CDP frameworks. We have TCFD frameworks. We have risk frameworks. Can you imagine that you will need to comply with all of these frameworks in order to showcase that you as an industry are working in terms of are working in the right manner as the international? And this was Amr's question also. It's a maze of frameworks. But the most important framework that I advise everybody to review is the SASB framework. Why is it the case? Because the SASB framework is reflecting the ESG issues from an investor's point of view, meaning they brought the investors across the world. What are the ESG issues that you are interested in? They answered them. The ESG issues that we are interested in are ESG issues that has direct implications on our financial performance. So we brought the ESG issues across the whole industry map and brought out those issues that has direct implications on the financial statements. And SASB have the list, open source. You can just click, download framework, cement industry, and you will understand and know what kind of frameworks. In this occasion, what I saw, and the final notes, what I saw that I would like to be a value added here is to expand upon the definition of the conference. You has mentioned we want to reduce CO2 and reduce costs. Until now, most of what has been said was how we can move forward. I wanted to add just one thing. What could be the cost of inaction? What could be the cost of inaction if this sector didn't move? In fact, those 6 particular companies understood what I want to talk about. They understood the point of what are the risks that we may inquire if we didn't act as fast as possible on this. To do this, they conducted what is called, and Bram is very well aware of this, a TCFD study, a task force on climate-related financial risks. And in these regards, I have done this for the cement industry in Egypt in order that we can now have a heat map. All what is in red, which is shared with the conference, all what is in red is the risks and their financial implications across the financial statements, balance sheet, cash flow, and asset management. And here is a summary of these risks, physical risks, their implications on all of the financial statements, transitional risks with implications with color on all of the financial statements and cash flows, and finally, opportunities that are also can be grasped out of different issues that we may counter on. I think this could start as a very preliminary blueprint that the World Cement Association can gather momentum around and show a case study on how these issues can be capitalized on, through which we can draw a roadmap and an action plan. Thank you so much.
Ehab. Can you go back about 6 to that, that graphic which looks like a snake? Keep going backwards. It looks a bit like a bit of sculpture, which should be sitting
Sure.
on Sheikh Zayed Highway. That one.
Yes.
It looks like a cross between a driving wheel and something else. But I want to leave that up there because that takes a bit of digesting and trying to unwind it. But I've got a couple of questions. Does anyone want to come in before we go to the final panel? For today, anyway. No one wants to come in. With ESG, do you believe people know what they're investing in?
With the new approach, yes. They are now aware.
It's clear.
It's very clear now.
Secondly, you used, as Bram did, and it's inevitable, the word green quite liberally. Do you think there's a danger and that many are capitalizing on this and almost hiding behind the ambiguity of what green really means or doesn't mean?
Yes, with only one exception when it comes to any relation with the European Union now. With the taxonomy closed all doors.
Bram?
I would agree that's a very important step towards that. So was that audible?
Yes, it was, yeah.
But inevitably, the reason that was introduced was exactly to overcome that issue, which is the kind of quite free use of the term green, and hence the risk of getting caught out, if you will, on this going forward, I would say much higher than before.
So literally there's no wiggle room anymore?
I mean, that's a little bit too optimistic, maybe, but for sure, with the taxonomy in place, I mean, that's quite sort of black and white.
Okay, because my final question, therefore, is it really clear what net zero is? I think you offered us something of a definition, but people talk so liberally, including politicians, about we're going for net zero by 2030, 2050, 2060 in Saudi Arabia. Is it clear what net zero really is, do you think?
For me, no. There are so many definitions of net zero. One of them is reducing 50% of what you emit only could be net zero. We have so many definitions, but again, what I want to say in this respect, not to have the wrong impression, I love starting all kind of initiative relaxed to bring everybody on the table.
Because the cement industry needs to have clarity. If you're going to say you're heading for net zero, you've got to know what you're heading for.
You will need to utilize your country definition, the national context definition.
Bram.
Which is Bram's definition in UAE.
Yeah, so there are subtle differences, that's right, sort of between country to country. Now, the additional complication is indeed, as I mentioned, net zero is the definition of reducing everything as far as you can up to the point that you want to offset it by other things. Now, of course, the ability to reduce as far as you can is a dynamic sort of line, if you will. So that, of course, the reality of that will change over time. And of course, the ultimate goal is not net zero, it's zero emissions.
I mean, one of the reasons I put this to you finally is that John Kerry has said to me, when I talked to him privately in a corner of a conference, he said, even net zero doesn't really underscore the urgency of what really has to be done.
Yeah.
It gives the idea that you can somehow compromise in order to get some way,
Yes.
but not the way that the whole distance that's got to be traveled.
Agree. I totally agree.
Bram?
Yeah, I agree too. We started with climate neutral, now it's down to net zero. The kind of incremental steps to kind of getting the ambition absolutely right.
Exactly. And why I totally agree on this. Put in mind something. Reaching net zero will not solve the problem. It's like diabetes. We already have diabetes. The issue is there. What we want to prevent is that the outcome of diabetes. بس كده. بس خلاص. The crisis is there, we are living it, even if we turned off.
This is to reassure you that if you feel there's an ambiguity or a lack of clarity, you are not alone. There are others out there who use a phrase, but they're not quite sure, many of them, most of them, exactly what it means. So bear that in mind for the next day of the conference. Ehab and Bram, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you
Let's
so
do a
much.
hot switch.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.